There's a real buzz in 19th century studies at the moment around Victorian sculpture, not least because of the current exhibition, Sculpture Victorious, Tate Britain, which came to London from the Yale Centre for British Art in New Haven. Sculpture is being talked about afresh at various associated symposia and in special journal issues, including upcoming issues of Word and Image and 19. Our location today in Oxford offers a good opportunity to talk about a fine example of late 19th century sculpture here, Edward Onslow Ford's Shelley Memorial in University College, Shelley's alma mater before he was sent down for atheism. This talk has its origins in a panel discussion that formed part of a brilliantly conceived conference on Romanticism at the fin de siècle, co-organised by my colleague at Birkbeck, Louisa Calais, and Stefano Evangelista at Trinity a couple of years ago. It was a panel that displayed the temporal, the geographical and the interdisciplinary reach of 19th century studies. And in talking about the Shelley Memorial today, these are aspects of BAVS that I wish to emphasise. The memorial commemorates Shelley's death by drowning in 1822. He was not yet 30. After his sailing boat, the Don Juan, sank in a storm on the Gulf of Spezia. It represents the drowned poet on the Italian shore where his body washed up, capturing the tragically premature death of this most romantic of romantic poets in its naturalistic rendition of the young man's lifeless body, modelled by the sculptor's son. Onslow Ford, whose work was associated with what Edmund Goss dubbed the new sculpture, was originally commissioned by the poet's daughter-in-law, Lady Shelley, to produce the work for the Protestant cemetery in Rome, where the poet's ashes are interred. However, it was considered by the descendants of his friend Edward John Trelawney, he's buried in the neighbouring plot, to be of too large a scale, and so it was presented instead to University College, where it was unveiled in 1893. The sculpture attracted considerable critical attention in the art press of the day. One critic who wrote a number of articles in the 1890s on Onslow Ford's work was Marian Hepworth Dixon, sister of the New Woman novelist and journalist Ella Hepworth Dixon. Dixon wrote of the huge challenge of memorialising Shelley, the great word painter, as she described him, who left his followers somehow inarticulate and is, moreover, already enshrined in our imaginations. He's already an abstraction for us, she declared in 1892. One of the ways in which Onslow Ford meets the challenge in this daring enterprise, as she calls it, is, she says, by being direct and outspoken. And she writes, the poet is represented as he was found on the storm-washed shore of Viareggio, lifeless, nude, cold, but still beautiful, inexpressibly beautiful in death. A branch which is a wreath and yet is not a wreath of laurels encircles the poet's head. He used to have the statue used to have such a wreath around its head. Effigies conventionally play with such ambiguities. The funeral shroud that's like a blanket, the sarcophagus that's like a bed, the death that's like a sleep. But the branch that is like a laurel wreath that once adorned the poet's brow crowns a body that is unmistakably a corpse. What Dixon found distinctive about Onslow Ford's sculpture was his poetic realism. Here is one, she says, to whom actuality is everything. His art, a very grave and tender art, is the apotheosis of what we call naturalism. In no other way, as she continues, would we have had the passionate poet, the passionate lover of the sea represented, but in just this wise, locked in the sea's embrace, white as the wild surf which engulfed him. So the drowned man, engulfed by the sea and the foaming waves themselves, have been reconstituted, reunified and realised as and in stone. The shoreline upon which the poet rests is a liminal space that signifies at once the threshold of ocean and land and of life and death. The sculptural figure as a form and the corpse share some disquietingly common characteristics. Both have a dynamic quality that is captured in Onslow Ford's sculpture and in contemporary writing about it. Both corpse and statue personify a mysterious and intriguing moment of transition, the reverse of which is signified by the Pygmalion myth, so beloved by artists, of the statue coming miraculously to life. The sculptural effigy in particular is, like the corpse, a simulacrum. It's an empty vessel that renders absence and loss painfully present through its verisimilitude. It is like, but is not, the person who was just there. It bears the still warm and tangible memory of the life that once animated the body, but is disappearing before our very eyes. The theatricality of the Shelley Memorial's mise en scène, even after its modification in the 1930s, reinforces the effect that this is a live encounter with death, that we're witnessing a passing. The elemental journey of Shelley's body as it was absorbed into the capacious natural biosphere had, by the time of the monument's creation, become legendary. The poet was drowned, taken by the underworld of the sea. Then his corpse was cremated, given up to the air through the action of fire. Then his remains were buried, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, returning the composite matter of his body to the earth. In his lyrical exploration of mortality and memorialisation, The Dominion of the Dead, Robert Pogue Harrison observes, "Human bodies, when they perish, share in this organic afterlife of the dead. They are rolled around in Earth's diurnal course, with rocks and stones and trees, to speak with Wordsworth." But as this familiar quotation itself demonstrates, he writes, "Human culture, unlike nature, institutes a living memory and not just a mineral retention of the dead." And so Shelley's gravestone in the Protestant cemetery in Rome is inscribed Cor Cordium, Heart of Hearts, followed by a quotation from Shakespeare's Tempest that memorialises the poet's elemental transformation, the sea change he underwent. "Nothing of him that doth fade but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange." One of the ways in which human culture memorialises the dead is by the marking of a grave at the site where the body is embraced by the earth. The sculptural ways in which we mark our end, prompts thoughts about the ground as a ceremonial site of origins and of ends. The grave becomes part of the sedimentary fabric between earth and sky, marking a material and indeed an elemental threshold. The manner of Shelley's death and interment complicates this story. For a start, the poet's heart, the cor cordium of his gravestone, did not, so the story goes, actually form part of the cremated remains buried in the Protestant cemetery. Snatched from the flames by Trelawney, it was kept by the poet's widow, Mary Shelley, wrapped in the manuscript of Adonais, Shelley's elegy to Keats, written the year before upon his friend's death. The precious relic was not actually buried until 1889 with the son who survived him, Sir Percy Florence Shelley. Furthermore, as the inscription also underlines, Shelley suffered a sea change, his body swallowed by the waves before being taken into the earth. Swinburne concludes his sonnet to Shelley, entitled Cor Cordium, with an image of the nursing earth and the sepulchral sea. Harrison explores our compulsion to ground our experiences of sorrow and loss and memory when he writes that human beings need an earthly foundation for their perspectives because in its solidity and stability, the earth is inscribable. We can build upon its ground, while the sea offers no such foothold for human worldhood. He contrasts the earth as a human habitus with the sea, which is, he says, dumb to human petition. It defies any and all humanisation because of what he calls its passion for erasure. He writes, "The site of disappearance remains unmarkable. there are no gravestones on the sea. History and memory ground themselves on inscription, but this element is uninscribable. It closes over rather than keeps the place of its dead, while its unbounded grave remains humanly unmarked. And what are those who are left behind? Tennyson invokes the mother praying for her sailor son in Memoriam. While thy head is bowed, his heavy-shotted hammock shroud drops in his vast and wandering grave. And he writes about his own feelings as he waits for his friend Arthur Hallam's body to be brought back from Vienna where he'd died, praying that his beloved friend's lifeless body will make it safely home to land for a proper burial, that the ship's dark freight, a vanished life, will not be consigned forever to what Matthew Arnold so memorably called the unplumbed, salt, estranging sea. Oh, to us, Tennyson writes, the fools of habit, sweeter seems to rest beneath the clover sod that takes the sunshine and the rains, or where the kneeling hamlet drains the chalice of the grapes of God, than if with thee the roaring wells should gulf him fathom deep in brine, and hands so often clasped in mine should toss with tangle and with shells. For the survivors of the drowned, there's a particular imperative to create an inscribable site that will enact the rescue and memorialisation of the dead. As Harrison points out, the words on Keats's grave in the Protestant cemetery of Rome, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water," were not written in water, but on a headstone that continues to hold the place of its reference. Just as Shelley's Sea Change was materially inscribed on his own nearby. The Shelley Memorial didn't end up marking his grave in the same burial ground as Keats as originally intended. Nevertheless, Keats is very present in Onslow Ford's monument to Shelley, who's said to have been carrying a volume of his friend's poetry when he drowned, corporeally as well as mythologically entwined, like the heart enveloped in his own elegy to Keats. Onslow Ford conjures something of their intertwined fate by incorporating into the bronze base of the monument a stanza from Adonais, lines which resonate with his vitalist belief in the spiritual power that energises and unifies the natural world, and in so doing claims that elemental domain for human culture. He is made one with nature, there is heard his voice in all her music, from the moan of thunder to the song of night's sweet bird. He is a presence to be felt and known, in darkness and in light. Shelley himself is memorialised and his name is writ in stone, not in water. The abstraction that Shelley had become, even by the time of the monument's creation, has found physical embodiment in Onslow Ford's corporeally realised monument. Sculpted marble audaciously supervenes upon the poet's bodily dissolution in water and fire. The engraved lines from his own elegy on poetry and death institute a living memory that is materially realised. Our relationship to this brilliantly transformative rendition of Shelley's corpse is both visceral and spiritual, physical and metaphysical. The monument signifies at once mortality, the poet's and our own, and transcendence, for it's an intensified dynamic site of convergence of past, present and future, Romanticism reimagined at the fin de siècle and experienced by us as surviving loved ones today. One of the striking things about the Shelley Memorial, and something that's evident from the way people wrote about it and still respond to it, is that it breaks down traditional distinctions between public and private commemoration of the dead, between the monument to a public figure, which is not about mourning, and the private marking paid for by their families of the loss of a loved one. I don't just mean that Onslow Ford's monument to the poet was commissioned by his daughter-in-law and intended to mark his grave, yet was executed 3/4 of a century after Shelley's death and is, in the event, a statue on a grand scale on display in an academic institution. I don't just mean that kind of contradiction. I'm suggesting also that, like other sculptural works from this period, it provokes a highly personal response in the viewer, or in this viewer at least, and thoughts about the emotional experience of looking at such an artwork, about how we bring to a public monument our own private experiences of loss, as well as, in this case, our reading of Shelley's poetry, our knowledge of the mythologisation of his life and death. Thoughts about how we respond with our bodies, with our hearts, with tears perhaps, across space and time. The register of contemporaneous critical writing about Onslow Ford, and this statue in particular, is very intimate. In language that reflects contemporary critical interest in the tactile imagination and the relationship between vision and touch, Marion Hepworth Dixon invokes the eye and the hand of the sculptor who wrought this memorial to the poet. She wrote, "The eye which could see and recreate for us the dead Shelley on the stormy shores of Viareggio was surely one that could look lovingly on the face of death. The hand which portrayed the impassioned poet, one that could caress even marble." A discourse of tactility was entering the art historical analysis of painting at the end of the 19th century, with Bernard Berenson's formulation of his signature theory about the tactile imagination and Vernon Lee's experiments in physiological aesthetics. But touch has altogether more purchase and complexity in writing about sculpture, where both thumb touch and finger touch are imaginatively invoked in relation to the three-dimensional physical materiality of the sculptural medium, whether clay, marble or bronze, and where the tactile response of the viewer seems to connect directly with the shaping hand of the sculptor, even to the extent of disavowing the mediating technologies of mechanical reproduction, as my colleague Patrizia Di Bello has so compellingly argued. Contemporary writing about the so-called new sculpture being produced at the FAM demonstrates a very particular kind of haptic engagement. 9 years after he made the Shelley Memorial, Edward Onslow Ford himself died and was subject to his own memorialisation, in words as well as in marble and bronze. His friend Frank Rinder's obituary in the Art Journal opens with a meditation on the sculptor's touch, moving from the literal to the metaphorical and from the man to his work, in a way that emphasises the triangulated tactile exchange between maker, object and viewer. He reproduces in the magazine the very piece Onslow Ford was working on at the time of his death, Snowdrift, a work that, when translated from soft clay into marble for the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition of 1902, would strikingly recall the sculptor's earlier Shelley Memorial. But it's the unfinished work in clay that he saw in the artist's studio that Rinder finds so moving, because it seems to him to capture a moment poised between life and death, when the corpse is not yet cold, the sculptor's touch is still warm. He wrote, "When I saw it in the studio, the clay was still soft, the handmarks of the artist were still, so to say, impermanent. What more aptly than this snowdrift could symbolise thoughts hardly to be packed into a narrow act, the all I could ever be, of a life which closed before the 50th milestone had been reached." Rinder's quotation from Robert Browning's Rabbi Ben Ezra here is particularly apposite at a time when a new emphasis on modelling in clay had revitalised Britain's art schools. For in that poem, God is figured as a potter at his wheel, mortal man as clay. The sculpture, Rinder tells us, is a figure born of snowflakes. An inscrutable fate has cast this personification of snowdrift, numbed, but surely with breath still issuing from the parted lips, upon some lone shore. There's no need to dwell on the pathos of this snowdrift, wrought, it's practically finished, as it was during the last weeks of Onslow Ford's life. So, almost unawares, did the peace of death come to freeze into an eternal calm his efforts here, the efforts of one whose sympathies, like sunlit snowflakes, had gladdened the hearts of many, caused them to step forward with uplifted instead of with downcast eyes. Another quotation there from the Browning poem, or reference to it. hovering ambiguously between freezing and melting, snow and sun, breathing and stillness, wind and calm. Snowdrift seems to epitomise not only the recently deceased artist, whose work has not yet hardened into permanence, but sculpture itself, and in particular the effigy, poised on the lone shore between life and death. Onslow Ford's sculpture draws on a common iconography of mourning and seems to invite intermedial quotation, as here from Browning. Andrea Carlo Lucchese's memorial to Onslow Ford in St John's Wood pays tribute to its subject's interest in the creative collaboration of the arts. Lucchese, who was himself a member of the Art Workers Guild, established in 1884 to promote the unity of the arts, incorporates a wreathed bust of Ford bearing an inscription from Hamlet, "To thine own self be true," one of several references the monument makes to Ford's interests in poetry and theatre. Ford's statue of Irving as Hamlet, 1883, was one of his defining works. The main figure at the front of the monument to Ford is a mourning woman seated in a melancholy pose with her lyre resting against her body, a reference to the sculptor's statue of the Muse of Poetry in Canterbury, which was sponsored by, amongst others, Tennyson and Irving, and unveiled by Irving at a big ceremony in 1891. The bronze figure of the Muse bending over her broken lyre, lamenting the death of Adonais on the base of the Shelley Memorial, also appears to refer to this sculpture, as well as, of course, to the poet for whom the Lewis Liberty made life a lyre, as Swinburne wrote. And Lucchese is perhaps alluding to both figures in his own monument to Ford. The intermedial dynamic of Onslow Ford's work lent itself to interdisciplinary interpretation by both critics and sculptors in his own day, and it does so now. Marion Hepworth Dixon described him as one of those artists who are poets as much as sculptors, and another contemporary critic, Helen Zimmern, called him a poet-sculptor. This is nowhere more evident than in the Shelley Memorial itself, which, in paying homage in stone to the poetry, the life and the myth of the Romantic poet at the end of the 19th century, captures so much of what that century grappled with. The legacy of Romanticism being the last Romantics, in Yeats's memorable phrase. A new kind of engagement with Europe, Italy in particular, with the inner life of the feelings being uncovered with the emergence of psychology, with the body and its representation, with naturalism, with secularism, with modernity itself. Thank you.